we're gonna start this one over. Okay, so for the first session of Race, Politics, and Women's Rights, we're gonna be talking about Shirley Chisholm, who was the first Black woman to run for the presidency, and we're gonna talk about how her career in politics and activism impacted the perception of Black women and their rights. And so we're just gonna jump right into her background. Shirley was born on November 30th, 1924 in Brooklyn, New York. She lived in Barbados from the ages of 3 to 10 with her grandmother on her mother's side. She had her whole primary education in Barbados, and she moved back to Brooklyn with her family in 1934. She attended Brooklyn College for her bachelor's degree and earned her master's at Columbia University in elementary education, and she married her first husband, Conrad Chisholm, in 1949. And so she had already established her, her entire life, her entire career, 20 years before she even went into her, political career in Congress and, running for the presidency. So I was thinking that's pretty interesting how, she already had her master's in, elementary education. She was, a teacher, a daycare center director. And she had done all these things even before she, had the impact she had in the political realm. And so I'm going to try to show you this clip from the 2004 documentary we're going to be using to talk about her life, which was called Chisholm 72, Unbought and Unbossed. And the whole documentary highlights her campaign for presidency, and it includes interviews with her campaign volunteers and Shirley herself, which we're going to be using in this presentation to break down who Shirley was, what happened throughout her campaign, and how her campaign and career influenced the way Black women view their role in society and their rights. As a young woman, Shirley was a director of a daycare center, and in 1968, she became the first Black woman elected to Congress. And the clip I'm about to play is, Shirley in her own words talking about the progression of her career from, daycare director to eventually, running for the presidency. So I'm gonna play it, and we're gonna hope that it works. Come on. There we go.
It's a picture of a picture of a daycare center in Manhattan. Of course, this is the day that we decided we were meant for each other. We got married in October 1949. This picture was taken of me when I was in the New York State Assembly. When I spoke to the members on the floor that day, they said, "There goes the school teacher." And this was the picture that was taken when I won my victory by being the first Black woman elected to the United States Congress. It was a very, very strenuous campaign. Oh, this last picture of me is a snapshot of me running for the President of the United States.
And so basically, what that clip was, it's a very simple clip, just her talking about pictures, photos that represented different parts of her career. But she was basically talking about how she went, from daycare director to, giving feedback to Congress, to becoming a congresswoman, to then becoming, a candidate running for the presidency. And so I just thought that it was like kind of interesting the way she explained it, and just showed how, how she progressed from someone who had no political experience to, someone that could go all the way to even attempting to run for president. But obviously, before we, even talk about her campaign for presidency, we have to talk about just a caucus. It was just a group of Black congressmen and Shirley. She was the only Black congresswoman who, would convene and, aim to go to the floor, seeking rights for the Black community and things that would benefit, minority communities. And she, following her run for the presidency, she, still continued her career in Congress until 1982. So she had an extensive and successful career as a congresswoman. But we got another clip. And this one is, I think it was a crucial clip to include because this clip is Shirley, in her own words, telling a story about one of her experiences in Congress as a woman, confronting another congressman because he would, continually make jokes about how, he was so shocked they were making the same amount of money. And I think this clip is going to really give an insight to her character and just who she was as a person. So I think, before even analyzing her campaign, we need to know who Shirley was, like how she dealt with things. And I think this is a perfect example of something that she went through, and in her own words, how powerful it is.
Of course, the media says she's a fighting woman. She doesn't take anything from anybody. So I think there's a lot of coming down there really to take them on immediately. So you had this particular representative from a certain state. And every day I would come into the chamber and he would say, "Hey, Stacey, how are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm feeling pretty well." "Man, imagine making 42.5. I said, "What did you say?" "Hey, Stacey, you're making 42.5. Like, you always kept hearing 42.5. So finally, one day, it's just too much. I said, "Two things. First of all, if you can't stand the idea of my making 42.5 like you, when you see me coming into this chamber each day, vanish. Vanish until I take my seat. So you won't have to confront me with 42.5. I said, secondly, you must remember, I'm looking like me to make 42.5.
Okay, so I know the audio might be kind of difficult to hear because, this was all filmed, in the 70s. But what she was basically saying was there were congressmen who would always, when she went into the chamber, would confront her about making the same amount of money. And, she got fed up with it. And at the end, she decided to go confront him about it. And, she basically told him, when you see me, vanish. I don't want to even see you. And I think that really showed how strong of a woman she was. Because, any other woman that was, the first woman in Congress of her race would probably think, I don't want to I don't want to be intimidated by these men, but I don't want to also be intimidating. But Shirley didn't care. She was like, I'm where I am. I'm at the same level as everyone else. And I think that, her standing up to this man and telling him this and saying, that she wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing this for so many other people, for, young Black women, young Black children, just the Black community entirely. I think it just really shows, who she was doing this for, what she was fighting for, and what she knew, like, her work would be doing. And so going into finally her run for the presidency, it's funny that I put supporters with a question mark because all the people that I'm about to talk about never fully supported her. The Black Caucus was reluctant to support her because she was a woman. The same Black Caucus she was a founder of, but yet again, she was, the only woman in the Black Caucus. So, the other male members found it hard to support her because, when she was a woman, it was a very sexist time, and they weren't sure what she would accomplish with this. And during the Black Political Convention of 1972, a vote was held on whether or not they would endorse her. And basically the Black Political Convention was just a convention that had, people from different political spheres. So, maybe men in Congress, Black voters, anyone that was involved in politics or anywhere was interested could come. And so it was a close vote, but they ultimately voted against endorsing her campaign. And in her own words, they just couldn't support me because more than anything else, I was a woman running for the presidency, a woman that just got to them. And much like with the Black Caucus, Chisholm never received the full support from the women's liberation movement, which was very much alive during the time. And we're going to be talking about being a woman in the 1970s. And this clip is just going to, show what it was like to be a woman, to be a Black woman in the 70s, and how that impacted, how they went about their lives and how daily life, societal life, political life looked for them. So that's what we're going to be looking at here.
As a representation of the right of the woman and the Black to run for the highest office in this land. That movement was led by Donna Asher. She used to say that I would support Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm is good, she's articulate, she knows it. But when the time came, she couldn't do it. She just could not do it. But of all the women that was in that COVID, Joyce Steiner was the one that really kind of held on. But she couldn't even go again, this was Nixon, and this is the war, and these were really serious things, and people wanted to be finally, with someone who could win and who could change things. And the only reason why they didn't go with her is one simple reason. Maybe Shirley Chisholm will say, but I'll say it. She was a woman, but she was black. And they themselves didn't accept. What can they say? That she was not a woman? So why are you not with her? And from New York and the liberal state. But she was black.
Okay, so that clip was more focused on the leaders of the women's liberation movement and how they didn't support Shirley, or they say they supported her as a woman, but they ultimately couldn't fully endorse her because she was a black woman at that. And they just, one, they were racist, and two, they just felt as if she wouldn't represent them because, of the color of her skin. And the second clip I have is more talking about like I said before, what it was like to be just a woman in the 1970s, and that's just going to kind of support the first clip you just watched. So I'm going to play that quickly and then explain both of them.
Black women were not valued, are not particularly valued. White men, highest value, white women, black men, black women. How do you not, fall into that psychologically? How do you not accept the idea that you are less than other people? There was a frustration that black women had of being marginalized in the civil rights movement, as well as in the predominantly white women's movement, that they sort of had fallen between the cracks, so to say. And this was a period when we were finding their voices, and black women in unprecedented ways. And they were in different arenas, there's literature, and then there's Shirley in electoral politics. So there's a great deal, there's another kind of individualism and sense of liberation in this period. What about Pam? You can tell your mother how? What, Mom? Her job is it working out? Great, Mother, just great. But can she still take care of you? That's fine, Mom, really. Women were perceived as really nice. There had not yet been a recognition of quality in most professions. It was an age in which a married woman couldn't have a department store credit card in her own name. She had to be Mrs. So-and-so because there was the assumption that the husband was paying the bills. The insurance on a car for an unmarried woman was much higher than it was for any other category because the insurance companies had the nerve to say that any unmarried woman with a car would be letting her boyfriends drive that poor car. So she would be an extra insurance risk. All these things were considered natural until the explosion of the women's movement. But it was particularly
Okay, so the two clips that I just showed you, they're crucial to understanding what it was like as a woman in the 1970s. And I think, seeing how women couldn't be really independent without the approval or the presence of a man really showed and puts into perspective just how radical it was for Shirley to, run for the presidency, and just how, quote unquote crazy it must have seemed to, have a woman running for the presidency and actually seriously running. And that's one thing she emphasized. She was seriously running for it. And she wasn't joking around. She wasn't doing it, symbolically. She was running. And I think these clips showed how, one, how black women were paid significantly less than men in general and white women, but it also emphasized the lack of rights women had in general. And, while these were the norms of the time, imagine what it was like to have all these norms and then see Shirley stand up and just be unapologetic about running for the presidency and believing in what she believes in and speaking up to these white men in power that, that it has always been that way. So I thought those two clips were crucial to understanding just what it would have seemed like in the time period to have Shirley run for the presidency. And so with these two things being said, this is a quick little excerpt from a Smithsonian Magazine article on Shirley, and saying of Shirley, I'll read it really quickly, she didn't downplay her feminism, she flaunted it. The very idea of a black woman in politics who made no apologies made her something of a punchline. In spite of her impressive background, Chisholm was never able to consolidate support from what should have been her two largest constituencies, women and minorities. Feminists were split over her candidacy. Gloria Steinem, who you would expect to have supported her, supported McGovern instead. That was significant, and it hurt on a personal level quite a bit. You can't look at 1972 through the same magnifying glass as 2016. Having a Black woman run for president was like having somebody from Mars run for president. And you have a Black woman running, and everyone, all interest groups, are grappling with how do you deal with such a changed landscape. People were not comfortable with having a Black woman, and she often said between being Black and being a woman, the biggest problem was being a woman. Black women tended to support her, but sexism was so prevalent at the time that she was discriminated against within the brand new Black Congressional Caucus. Now, reading that, imagine how difficult it must have been for Shirley to run her campaign, because one, trying to find supporters in the women's liberation movement, she found some, but they couldn't fully support her, not because she wasn't a woman, but because she was Black. And then in the Black Congressional Caucus, in the Black community, she couldn't, really consolidate many supporters there other than Black women because they were very sexist. And so, this is something that she also said she felt like she was in between two worlds, and she couldn't, fully rely on one for support. So she was kind of, in a sense, alone in a way, feeling ignored by these two worlds, as many Black women were feeling, ignored by the women's liberation movement because they were women, but they were Black also, and feeling ignored by, the Black liberation movement, just not because they weren't Black, but because they were women. So, Black women could really look to Shirley, and she was feeling the same things they were feeling, not just because she was a Black woman, but because she was a politician, a Black politician, having to really deal with these issues between these two interest groups. And so before we go into, the Democratic National Convention, which is the showdown for any candidate for president, we're going to take a quick detour into the women's liberation movement, since it really intersected with Shirley's campaign and what the campaign was like for Shirley. And so a little background on the women's liberation movement: it began in the late 1960s and lasted well into the 70s and 80s, established on feminist beliefs and the demand for equality between women and men. And so, as described in an article written by the University of Richmond, as the women's liberation movement continued, the disparity between the needs and agendas of Black feminists and white feminists became more evident. In the Black Women's Liberation pamphlet, 2 articles, Why Women's Liberation is Important to Black Women by Maxine Williams and Take a Look at Our Problems by Pamela Newman, identify the unique needs of Black women that serve to divide Black feminists from the women's liberation movement. The authors identify the aspects of the women's movement that hindered the involvement and development of minority women, like racist sentiments and narrowly oriented set of goals that favored white upper and middle class women. The narrow class-focused orientation and goals of white feminists led many Black feminists to value racial liberation over gender liberation. And basically what this is saying is that the women's liberation movement, yes, there were Black and white women that were both in the liberation movement, but more than that, it was hard for Black women to keep going in the women's liberation movement because most of the leaders were upper to middle class, middle class to upper class white women, and those women never experienced what it was like, never empathized with what it was like to be a Black woman in America, and so they were only fighting for rights, for beliefs, for issues that only impacted them. So Black women, Black feminists began to feel ignored in the women's liberation movement. And, what this did was this caused them to want to separate themselves in a way from the women's liberation movement because they were, tired of feeling ignored, tired of, feeling like secondhand citizens, not only because they were women in the 1970s, but also because they were Black women. And so that leads into women's liberation and Black feminism. And I am not here to argue that women's liberation and Black feminism are 2 completely separate things. They definitely are intersectional, but we can also argue that they were in a way, 2 separate movements or, a sub-movement or parallel. Because while the women's liberation movement strove for equality between men and women, they seemed to focus more on issues, like I said, that would benefit white women. And I just want to put into perspective when these events happened in relation to Shirley's campaign and, the impact Shirley had. And so from an article, detailing the history of Black feminism, the Black feminist movement was formed to address the way sexism, racism, and classism influenced the lives of Black women whose needs were ignored by the Black men of the Black liberation movement and the white women of the women's movement. The movement has spawned several important organizations which are committed to the struggle against all forms of oppression. They have created a unique model for cross-class organizations in which the needs of the poor are not usurped by the needs of the middle class and the wealthy. And so that last sentence there, where it says, in which the needs of the poor are not usurped by the needs of the middle class and wealthy, that to me, came directly from what had happened with the women's liberation movement, where, middle class and wealthy white women were not meeting the needs of, working class Black women, middle class Black women, poor Black women. And I think that, they became fed up with it. And that's when Black feminism was born, of, the lack of attention that they were receiving as women from the women's liberation movement. And so that being said, we can really see how, during Shirley's campaign, how she wasn't receiving help from the women's liberation movement, how she wasn't receiving complete support from the Black community, and how, just as she strove to find some constituents to support her in Black women did the exact same thing when they didn't feel support from, the women and the Black community, and they created their own movement to support them and to seek the rights that they wanted as women, not only as women, but as Black women. And so, with that being said, that quick detour, we're going to go back to Shirley and talk about the Democratic National Convention of 1972. And so Shirley Chisholm went to the Democratic National Convention with 152 delegates. And so every candidate in the Democratic National Convention, they have to have some type of, some number of delegates in order to be considered official. And so while this may not seem like, a really big number, 152, George McGovern, who was the really front runner in the, for the candidates in the Democratic National Convention, think of George McGovern as like Joe Biden now. He was like, who everyone was seeing as the, the prime guy that was definitely going to, win all the votes at the DNC. He had almost 1,200 delegates. And so looking at 152, some people might think, oh, that's such. There were, almost 10 or 11 people below her that couldn't even get the amount of support that she got in delegates. So I just thought that was really, that was an accomplishment in and of itself, that she was able to consolidate so many delegates in the time that she did, and, in the time period that she was in, and, who she was and who she was representing. That's like something, that's and negotiating with the other candidates, because she knew that those other white men that were candidates weren't going to care how she ran her campaign. If she blatantly ran it, white woman's power or Black power, all they were going to ask her was, how many delegates do you have? And she knew that if she came with a good enough number of delegates, she could negotiate and bargain with the, the front runners of the DNC, who people really thought were going to win, like men like George McGovern. She could use her delegates to tell him, this is what I want for the Black community. This is what I want you to do. And that's exactly what she did. She played by their game. She knew exactly how they, played their political game at the DNC, and she, followed their rules, and she did it quite successfully. And even though, her team really ran, and they were running seriously, as I said, they wanted to win. But they were ultimately beat by George McGovern of South Dakota, who won the nomination. And I thought it was funny. He later lost to Richard Nixon by a complete landslide. Like, he had there was no way he was going to win, and he didn't. You could look it up, George McGovern versus Richard Nixon. It's pretty funny to see how badly he lost. But although she didn't win the nomination, her impact is evident and is still talked about years later. And so we're just going to go into that, how her career, finally answering what this is about, how it impacted Black women and Black women's rights. And first and foremost, the fact that every part of her career, every aspect of what she did as a politician, challenged the racist and sexist norms of the 1970s, showed both women and just Black women in general that there could be more to life than the limits originally placed on them by a patriarchal society, by a society dominated firstly by white men and then just by men. And as we saw in the video clip from her documentary, women were treated as secondhand citizens, and they were not permitted to have any individual freedom without approval or the presence of a man. And to add on to these things, much like Frances Harper spoke about in, the women's suffragette era, Black women not only had to deal with the discrimination that came with being a woman, but they also had to deal with the prejudice that also came with being a person of color. And so with that being said, her legacy as a politician and as the first Black woman to achieve such political feats at the time showed women everywhere that they didn't have to adhere to the limits set for them, that they had the right to achieve whatever it is they wanted to do, whether it was in the political sphere, economic, career-wise, social. What she, represented who they could be. She showed them that they didn't have to be woman in a man's world. They could be woman in a woman and men's world. So that was that little, that was my little take on that. But also since this series is about politics, I also wanted to look into how her career and campaign impacted Black women's participation in voting and politics. And so I found this this article that spoke about the Chisholm effect, which was 50 years after Shirley was such a political role model. Like how does it look for Black women in politics now? And so Glenda Carr made important political gains, even as our country struggles against some of the most regressive, dangerous leadership and gains and policies propagated since before Chisholm's emergence. And since her 1968 election, 38 Black women have held seats in Congress representing 16 states. And of course, this is, not even close to the number of Black women representing states that we want to see. But she's showing that it's been growing over the years. And the role modeling effect that Glenda Carr spoke about is basically an effect where Black women see other Black women in politics, and it pushes them to do the same, or to want to be a politically participating voter, or just a person in general that is very active in politics. And I think it's an appropriate assumption to make that Shirley was one of the first Black female politicians to be part of this role modeling effect. And something interesting that I looked into and I really found, quite enlightening in a way, was that Shirley in 1968 in the 92nd U.S. Congress, she was the first Black woman elected to Congress. In the 93rd U.S. Congress, which was, I think, about 3 or 4 years after she was elected, that number jumped from only one Black female congressional representative to 3. So, 3 more Black women decided to run in the next U.S. Congress, and they were all elected. So, as you can see, it went from 1 to, 3, and, it slowly started growing. And I think that really just shows, it can't only, we can't just give all the credit to Shirley, but I think she really did start paving the way for, Black women to make their mark in politics and to begin, what is still the beginning of, Black women dominating politics. And another quick fact that came out of the article is that Black women have become one of the largest group of voters that turn out during elections. And if you know me, you know that I don't just like to, cite sources from articles. I also like to look at the numbers. So I have some numbers here. And this is gender differences in voter turnout from the years 1984 to 2012. I split it up just so we could have a better view of it. And so, as you can see, it's separated by race. And the first column of numbers in millions we see are women, and the second is men, but we're just going to be focusing on women. And so, as you can see, I couldn't find any data from the 70s. I initially told a friend that it was because they hated women and they didn't want to get that data. But in all seriousness, the closest I could find was the 80s. So, as we can see, the number of Black women that voted in 1984 was 6.1 million. In 88, it went down just a tad bit to 5.9. Starting in 1992, however, it went to 6.6, 96, 6.7, 2000, 7.6, going on to 2004, 8.3, 9.4, and then 10.4 million in 2012. And as you can see, that grew exponentially starting in the 90s. And, while I'm not, like I said, giving all the credit to Shirley, she started this slow movement of, Black women really turning out, to turn out in voting, turn out in politics, and, to really be activists and really look to the political sphere to, ask for women's rights, for, rights in the Black community that weren't being sought out with all of these, white men in power. And so I just thought it was really interesting to be able to actually see the numbers of how, as recently as 2012, how, the voters that turned out were increasing with time. They weren't decreasing, they weren't staying the same. And I think that's, a really good thing to know. And so we got it, guys. We went through it, and time permitting, is there any questions or points of discussion anyone would like to bring up? That's I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to go back to the Zoom, and if you want me to come back, I will totally come back. But that was my little presentation, and I'm going to come back and share my video. And if anyone has anything to say, any questions or anything in general, to wrap up, we have about 15 minutes of time left. You feel free to type something, or just turn your mic on if you can and say it. Yeah, you should be able to unmute yourself if you have questions, or you could just type if you don't feel like speaking. But yeah, that was my little presentation on Shirley Chisholm and her impact, and just how great of a woman she was. I honestly love her after doing this. She's a great woman.
So Leslie, great job. I was wondering what you thought, given what you've taken us through, very thoughtful, analytical. You've given us a lot to think about. But what are you thinking now in terms of this push now, if we're going to make your presentation have some contemporary leanings? What do you think of this push to have a Black woman as a running mate to Joe Biden? Any thoughts on this? I'd love to hear from you or any of the other participants on whether this is, like, what would Shirley Chisholm think about this push to have Biden have a Black woman as a running mate?
Yeah, I can start off with that. I think Shirley would think about how good it would be in a way, because there would actually be someone that was a woman of color looking out for the minority community, the African American community, and there'd be someone there actually really seeking out successes for those communities. But I think she'd also be kind of worried, because she would wonder about how does Joe Biden really want a Black woman, or just a Black VP in general, or is he doing that to consolidate more constituents for his support? I think that's just a general question anybody could have of any politician that was thinking of doing that. But that's definitely something to think about. I think it's a great idea, because no matter what Joe Biden's intentions are, I think it's still a win to have someone there supporting, someone that understands what the struggle is like of being Black in America, something I can never understand, something that lots of people that aren't Black can't understand. And I think Shirley would understand that, and I think she would find that as a win, her being the first Black female to even try to run for the presidency. I think it would be such a success to see a Black female woman in the vice presidency. That's a step in the right direction, definitely.
Yeah, also, Leslie, like, mirroring what Dr. Shonican said, like, great job on the presentation. And I think, yeah, like, part of what you're talking about, especially like with the graphic with like voter numbers and whatnot, that I think is very interesting, is that there has been a continuous push for more Black voting, more Black involvement in electoral processes. And so I want to know, like, what your research has said, less about, like, particularly, like, let's say Joe Biden, his running mate, but do you feel that, we in the United States are more prepared or open to the idea of a Black woman as congresswoman, as president, than we were when she first went? Or do you feel that the circumstances are just very different?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that one thing I really got out of, researching Shirley's campaign was that she knew she was ahead of her time. She understood that, she wouldn't be getting a lot of support to actually win the nomination, but she did it, and she ran strongly anyways. And I think that, the America then and the America now it's both very different than it was in, certain aspects, but it's also very much the same. The same racism that was experienced in the 70s is still definitely being experienced now in 2020. But I do think, certain aspects, like the way women are seen, women are treated, it's more equal than it was in the 70s. Not completely equal. We're not even close to complete equality in many aspects. But I think it would be a little more accepted because, when Shirley ran, like I read from one of the excerpts in, the articles that I was using, it was like seeing someone from, Mars running, because you had never seen that before. But now we have such, we've had so many more Black politicians. We've had, Kamala Harris. We've had Stacey Abrams. We've had so many just activists that it's not too crazy to think about, and even just women of color like AOC and just other women that, have started to come into Congress and fight for the rights that, that in the 70s that all the, men weren't fighting for. And so I do think America's a bit more prepared to see that now, but definitely, not completely. There will definitely be a whole side of America that, is still stuck in those old times and isn't ready for it. So, I think it's more of a hit or a miss. We'll see what happens. I mean, I always have hope. I'm pretty optimistic. But yeah, we just have to see what becomes of it and hope for the best.
I see Amber has her hand up.
Well, Amber, you could talk or you could type. Okay.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously Shirley Chisholm did a lot to encourage Black women to get involved in the political process, but do you think there were any, do you think that white America retaliated at all as a result of her presidential campaign?
That's a good question. From the research I did, it definitely seemed as if more like there weren't many white politicians that supported her. I remember, watching her entire documentary. She said that there were only in all the about 13 white men that were running with her. Only 2 of them, she said, were like decent human beings that were nice to her. The other candidates that were running, report.
Oh, Leslie, you cut out for a minute.
That she could have gotten. And I think that's one thing I definitely saw as retaliation. And there's no other big things I could see after her campaign that try to hinder, Black women from going into politics or, white people from supporting Black politicians. But that was definitely one thing that struck me as, these white men in power trying to silence her in a way and trying to, make sure she didn't, she didn't succeed in the way she did. And one more thing that I am remembering right now is that at, I think it was one of the conventions she attended, George McGovern, who was ultimately the candidate that won the nomination, he had a supporter who is this very prominent activist. I keep forgetting his name. He was a Black activist, and he made a very powerful speech for delegates to side with George McGovern. And so all of Shirley's delegates that were at that convention were pushed off the delegate floor because of that. So that was another way that Shirley, that her supporters, like, she didn't get a chance to gain more supporters at that convention because George McGovern used, in a sense, that Black leader to have more supporters for him and not for her. So that's another way of retaliation that a white man in power used to not be able to have her consolidate more supporters that she could have at that convention possibly. So those are the 2 main things coming to my head that happened really during her campaign, with other candidates really using their power to turn her off and cut off her opportunity to gain more people to support. So that's what I'm really thinking of, but that's definitely something that I want to do more like, yeah, I'm digging into, and like I could definitely do that, and you know, like let you know what I find.
I think that's such a good question. I think it's a question that we can use to even think about the Obama administration and then what happened after the Obama administration. I think that sort of specter of white supremacy is always, unfortunately, is always hovering over these sort of spurts of Black progress. And I wonder if the same question could be used. I mean, I have heard that same question used to think about the transition from the Obama era to the Trump era. So yeah, very good question.
All right, perfect. I know some people are shy, they might not want to ask a question, so that's absolutely fine. But if anybody has anything, you know, like right now, please feel free. And if not, we could wrap up.
So Leslie, in your wrap up, if there are no other questions, can you give us a little preview of what your next couple of sessions will be?
Yeah, so for the next 2 sessions, I will be focusing on 2 more Black women in power. The first is Angela Davis, who is more of an activist than an active politician. And she came up not around the same time as Shirley. She was, I think, born maybe 10, 20 years after, but she was more prevalent during the, you know, late 70s and 80s. So I'm trying to, like, you know, take different, you know, Black women in different decades per se, or different time periods. So we'll be looking at her next, her impact, not only on Black women's rights, but on, you know, their perception of politics, their participation, and I'll be looking at her. And then I'll be doing my last session on Stacey Abrams, who is, you know, she is a Black politician, and I'm going to be talking about her because she's actually currently a politician. So that'll be more contemporary, and I'll be using her impact on Black voters right now. She actually wrote the foreword in the Chisholm effect study, which was a study done on the participation of Black women in America. So I'll be using, you know, her writing, her speeches. It'll be a little more modern and mainstream than Shirley was. I know this is probably kind of, you know, different, seeing something from such a different era that seems so long ago. So I'll be doing 2 more recent politicians and activists and how they impacted, you know, Black women, the Black community, and just, you know, just the political sphere in general. And that's what I'll be doing for my next 2 sessions.
Great. I look forward to it.
All right. Okay, so it seems like no one else has questions. So with that being said, thank you all for coming so much. Thank you for handling my, you know, my nervousness and my stuttering, and I'm really appreciative of everyone that came. So thank you so much.